The Senate chamber crackled with a tension so thick it felt like a storm pressing down on a silent town. Rows of senators shifted in their seats, some pretending to shuffle papers, others peering over their glasses with thinly veiled anticipation. Reporters leaned forward, fingers hovering over keyboards, sensing a headline was about to write itself. The air buzzed with fluorescent light and the low hum of murmured whispers, a stage set for drama. And when, with a smirk curling across his lips, Senator Tommy Tuberville leaned into his microphone and let out a chuckle that wasn't just laughter. It was mockery. It wasn't loud. It wasn't theatrical, it was worse, dismissive. That chuckle slithered through the room like a provocation, daring someone to rise against it. "Well," he said, voice dripping with condescension, "maybe the Congresswoman should calm down and let the grown-ups talk?" A ripple of uncomfortable laughter followed from a few of his colleagues, the kind that tries to mask discomfort but instead amplifies cruelty. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. Seated just across from him, her expression was a study. In controlled fire, calm but unyielding. She met his gaze with the kind of steadiness that made cameras instinctively zoom closer. You could almost hear the silent click of phones recording, the shuffle of staffers glancing nervously at their bosses. The world had seen Tuberville's antics before, but something in Jasmine's stillness hinted this wouldn't be another. Viral clip of political theater. It felt personal. Online, the clip was already spreading, seconds after his words fell like stones. Commenters lit up Twitter with outrage, disrespectful, racist undertones. Another day, another embarrassment. Hashtags bubbled to the surface, memes being born in real time, though Jasmine herself sat motionless, her dark eyes fixed on him, unblinking, unshaken. And then she spoke softly, so softly that at first the microphones almost missed it. She said, "You want to talk about grown-ups?" Her voice didn't rise, but the sharpness in it silenced even the nervous chuckles from Tuberville's allies. The room stilled. Everyone knew this was about to become one of those moments. She leaned forward slightly, not in aggression but in focus, as if steadying herself for something heavier than an insult match. There was a gravity to her calm, a strength born from something deeper than politics. This wasn't about party lines or sound bites. There was a story behind that unwavering stare, one that no smirk could shake loose. Tuberville's grin faltered for a fraction of a second, enough for the cameras to catch it. The energy in the room shifted. The power dynamic had flipped so subtly that only the keenest eyes noticed. And Jasmine wasn't done, because while the senator thought this was a game, Jasmine was about to tell a story soaked in sacrifice and service, one that would pierce through his arrogance like a blade through silk. But no one could have predicted what came next. The clash between Senator Tuberville and Congresswoman Crockett wasn't just another headline in a news cycle bloated with outrage. It was a collision years in the making, a flashpoint born of policies that had left entire communities feeling invisible, unheard, and disrespected. Tuberville had built his brand on provocation, thriving in a political landscape where cruelty had become currency. For months, he'd stalled key military promotions in protest of reproductive health policies, holding the careers of decorated service members hostage to score points with a hardline base. His smirk wasn't just about one exchange in a Senate chamber. It symbolized a growing boldness, a swagger that told marginalized Americans their sacrifices no longer mattered. Jasmine Crockett represented the opposite pole, a freshman congresswoman with roots deep in working-class grit. She carried herself with the conviction of someone who didn't see politics as a game, but as a battlefield for dignity. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who had written home in trembling script about the horrors he endured for a country that still judged him by the color of his skin, shaped her worldview. She grew up understanding that democracy wasn't an abstract idea, it was a fight. That fight had followed her all the way to this hearing room, where Tuberville's mockery felt less like an insult to her and more like a slap to every soldier's folded flag, every immigrant's naturalization certificate. Every voter told their voice didn't count. The political climate was ripe for explosions. With elections looming, division had calcified into identity, and leaders like Tuberville leaned into theatrics to energize a fractured base. Jasmine, however, had built her platform on something quieter, but far more dangerous to his narrative: empathy. She spoke to the mothers of soldiers stationed overseas, the immigrants working 2 jobs while dreaming of citizenship, and the young voters who had grown tired of cynicism. To Tuberville, she was a threat not because of her voice's volume, but because of its truth. This wasn't just a debate. It was a referendum on who gets to define American patriotism. For decades, men like Tuberville had worn that word like a crown, as if service and sacrifice belonged only to those who looked or thought like them. Jasmine's very presence at that table was a challenge, a reminder that the heart of America didn't beat solely in boardrooms or country clubs, but in barbershops, classrooms, and immigrant kitchens. The stakes were more than symbolic. Tuberville's blockade had delayed military promotions at a scale unseen in modern history, weakening readiness and morale. It wasn't just policy. It was people, families left in limbo, careers stalled, sacrifices ignored. Jasmine had prepared for this confrontation with the precision of a lawyer and the fire of a daughter, who'd once read her father's trembling words from a foxhole overseas. And in this chamber, under harsh fluorescent light, the tension became palpable. The smirk on Tuberville's face was the kind of arrogance that told Jasmine this wasn't about debate decorum. This was about rewriting narratives. Phones vibrated in reporters' laps as notifications spread like wildfire. Viewers tuning in live could feel it too, that hum in the air, that unmistakable sense that something seismic was about to break, what no one realized yet. As Tuberville leaned back with his arms crossed and Jasmine sat poised like a coiled spring, was that this wasn't just a hearing or a viral moment in the making. This was a turning point for America, and Jasmine Crockett was just getting started. For years, Tommy Tuberville moved through politics like a man convinced the rules were for other people, before he ever set foot in the Senate chamber. He had already cultivated an image that was part small-town coach, part political outsider, an entirely self-styled kingmaker. He wasn't a career politician, he would brag. He was a straight shooter, a common-sense guy sent to Washington to shake things up. But beneath that folksy drawl and football coach charisma was a swagger that often veered into contempt. Not just for his opponents, but for the very system he swore to serve. Tuberville had always been comfortable with controversy. Long before he launched his Senate run, he was a household name in college football, a coach known as much for his temper as his play calling. His reputation was steeped in machismo, built on sidelines where winning meant everything and humility rarely entered the conversation. When he traded the roar of stadiums for the polished halls of Congress, he brought with him that same bravado, a belief that politics, like football, was a game to dominate. For a while it worked, when he rode a wave of populist anger to victory. His supporters saw him as an antidote to Washington elitism. But almost immediately, cracks began to show. Tuberville stumbled over basic facts, admitting he didn't know the 3 branches of government during interviews, mixing up global leaders, and confusing his own policy positions. Instead of humility, he doubled down on arrogance, spinning his blunders into proof that he was just like regular folks. Critics called it ignorance. Tuberville called it authenticity. The controversies piled up. His decision to block hundreds of military promotions over Pentagon policies wasn't just political theater. It was a calculated gamble to prove his power. He effectively held service members' careers hostage, insisting that his personal stance on abortion policy was worth grinding military readiness to a halt. For months, decorated officers waited in limbo, families packed and repacked boxes as their futures stalled. And international allies watched American dysfunction play out like a reality show. Tuberville brushed off criticism with a shrug. To him, the suffering of others was collateral damage in his crusade to score points with his base. And yet, he remained smugly untouchable. News outlets wrote exposes, veterans organizations condemned him. Even members of his own party whispered their frustration. But Tuberville carried himself with the grin of a man convinced that outrage was fleeting, that the cameras would always move on, that his position in the Senate was armor. Against accountability, his hypocrisy was glaring. He had built his image as a patriot, draping himself in flags and slogans. Yet he was a man who had never served, lecturing generals on morality while ignoring the sacrifices of those who had risked everything. He posed with veterans for photo ops while simultaneously sabotaging their careers from behind the comfort of a Senate desk. His version of patriotism was performative, a costume worn for applause at rallies, while his actions betrayed a disregard for the very people he claimed to honor. But that arrogance, the same arrogance that made him laugh in Jasmine Crockett's face, wasn't just confidence, it was hubris. Tuberville believed that in this era of endless headlines and political tribalism, consequences no longer existed. To him, there was no exchange of ideas, no meaningful debate, only winning or losing. And he thought he'd already won. Behind closed doors, colleagues rolled their eyes, but rarely challenged him directly. Few wanted to risk being on the receiving end of his disdain, or worse, the backlash from his devoted supporters. Tuberville had learned that power wasn't about intellect or integrity. It was about fear. If enough people feared your wrath or feared losing your voters, then arrogance could pass for authority. What he didn't account for was someone like Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't afraid of him or of the performative power he wielded. She had seen worse. She'd grown up surrounded by quiet heroes, her father, her neighbors, her community, who had carried the weight of systemic injustice with dignity. Laughter was just another echo of the condescension they'd all endured for generations. For years, he thought he was untouchable. Every gaffe became a meme, every criticism another badge of outsider credibility. He mocked wokeness, dismissed diversity initiatives, and weaponized cultural resentment for applause. It worked so well, he believed it always would. But every empire built on hubris eventually cracks. Not because the world suddenly grows brave, but because someone finally stands up with a truth too powerful to ignore. Tuberville had mistaken Jasmine Crockett for another political opponent, another name on a ballot. What he didn't realize yet was that this moment, this seemingly small exchange in a committee hearing, wasn't hers to lose. It was his reckoning. And as cameras zoomed in on that smug grin, as his arms rested casually on the table, the seeds of his downfall were already being sown. In just a few breaths, his dismissive chuckle would become a symbol of everything Americans were tired of: the arrogance, the hypocrisy, the sneering disrespect for sacrifice and service. Tommy Tuberville thought this was just another day in Washington. He didn't know he was about to become a cautionary tale. Long before Jasmine Crockett ever set foot in the marbled halls of Congress, before her calm stare could silence a Senate committee room, she was a little girl sitting cross-legged on a worn carpet, listening to her father's voice tremble as he read aloud a letter he'd written decades earlier from a muddy foxhole in Vietnam. She didn't yet understand the politics of that war, or the racism her father faced when he returned home, but she could feel the weight in his words. They carried more than fear, they carried duty. It was that sense of duty, of sacrifice for something bigger than yourself, that would shape every decision she made for the rest of her life. Jasmine grew up in a modest Texas neighborhood where patriotism wasn't a slogan. It was a flag folded into a triangle on the mantle, a family photo with an empty chair. Her father had worn the uniform of a country that often treated him as invisible, yet he never let bitterness harden his heart. Instead, he taught his daughter that dignity wasn't granted by others. It was something you carried inside. Even when the world tried to take it from you, money was tight, but Jasmine's home was rich with resilience. Her mother worked double shifts at a nursing home, often coming home too tired to speak, but never too tired to smile at her daughter. Jasmine watched her parents sacrifice so she could dream bigger, so she wouldn't have to choose between dignity and survival. Those sacrifices became the fuel behind her every achievement. She excelled in school, not because it was easy, but because she refused to let the weight of circumstance dictate her future. Teachers noticed her sharp mind, her natural ability to cut through noise and get to the heart of a question. In debate club, she wasn't the loudest voice, but she was the one who left judges silent, considering her words long after she stepped down. Even then, Jasmine understood the power of precision, of speaking not just to win an argument, but to shift the room's moral gravity. College wasn't guaranteed, but Jasmine made it happen through a patchwork of scholarships, part-time jobs, and relentless determination. She worked nights at a diner, memorizing case law during breaks, her textbooks stained with coffee rings. Law school followed, and with it came more battles, professors who underestimated her, peers who dismissed her, systems that seemed designed to push her out, but she stayed. Every late night, every rejection letter, every microaggression only sharpened her resolve. By the time she became a civil rights attorney, Jasmine was more than just a lawyer. She was an advocate who understood the human cost of injustice because she'd lived it. She represented families whose stories mirrored her own. Mothers working endless hours, fathers carrying the invisible scars of military service. Children learning resilience far too young. Her victories weren't just legal wins, they were lifelines. Thrown to people who had been ignored for too long, her reputation grew quietly. Not through viral moments or flashy speeches, but through relentless work. She walked into courtrooms not to grandstand, but to fight for dignity, case by case, person by person.
Ow.
He had a razor-sharp intellect and an unshakable moral compass. She didn't. Need to shout to command attention? She spoke with the authority of someone whose life had been forged in struggle. When she ran for Congress, few gave her a chance. She didn't have the wealth or the backing of big political machines. What she had was a community behind her, a deep network of neighbors and families who trusted her, because she had already been fighting for them long before she had a title. Her campaign wasn't built on glossy ads or empty promises. It was built on kitchen table conversations, on listening before speaking, on reminding people that politics wasn't supposed to be a spectator sport. Her victory was a shock to the establishment, but not to the people who had walked the journey with her. Jasmine entered Congress with the same humility she'd carried her entire life, refusing to let the title change her. She was there to make sure the people who'd lifted her up had a seat at the table. And yet Washington had a way of trying to grind people down, especially women of color who dared to speak with conviction. Colleagues dismissed her. Commentators underestimated her. Opponents mocked her. But Jasmine didn't flinch, because she had been underestimated her entire life. She had learned to turn that underestimation into power. Every time she looked at that folded flag on her parents' mantle, she remembered why she was there. Her father's letter from Vietnam wasn't just a piece of family history. It was a reminder that sacrifice is meaningless unless it leads to justice. She carried his words with her into every debate, every hearing, every vote. So when Tuberville laughed at her across that committee table, he wasn't just laughing at Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman. He was laughing at her father's service. At every family who'd sent their children off to war while politicians played games with their futures, that smirk wasn't just arrogance, it was a challenge. And Jasmine had been preparing for that. Challenge her entire life. From the late nights at the diner, to the grueling trials in courtrooms, to the skepticism she faced on the campaign trail. Every moment had been a rehearsal for this one. She didn't raise her voice, didn't let anger cloud her face, because she understood something Tuberville didn't. True power doesn't need to shout. As cameras zoomed in, capturing her unflinching stare, no one in that chamber could yet see the storm she was about to unleash. They thought this was just another tense exchange in a long, exhausting news cycle. Little did they know, she was ready for this exact moment. The air in the chamber grew thick, almost suffocating. As Tuberville leaned back in his chair, his grin widening like a man who thought he'd already won, he tapped his pen against the table, a steady rhythm meant to irritate, to remind everyone that he was in control. The laughter that had started as a snicker now echoed faintly in the silence, the kind of sound that burrows under your skin. He cleared his throat loudly, theatrically, and said, "Congresswoman, with all due respect, maybe you should listen more and talk less. We've got important business here." His words dripped with condescension, the kind of tone that had silenced so many others before her. Senators exchanged glances, some smirking in quiet approval, others averting their eyes to avoid the discomfort radiating through the room. A few staffers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to look down at their notes or watch the exchange. Unfold, Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. She simply placed her hands neatly on the table, her back straight, her expression unreadable. It was a calm so sharp it was unsettling, like the stillness before a storm. The tension grew heavier, and the cameras zoomed closer. Sensing that this wasn't just a routine disagreement, it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. Tuberville, emboldened by her silence, leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice dripping. "With smugness? I get it," he sneered. "You're passionate. That's cute. But let's not waste time with emotional outbursts. Some of us actually came here to govern." The words landed like a slap, the smirk behind them daring her to react. But Jasmine's face remained a mask of control, her gaze steady and unyielding. She let the insult hang in the air, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a quick retort. The room felt smaller now, every breath caught in anticipation. Even the reporters at the back had stopped typing, their fingers hovering over keyboards, waiting for the next move. Tuberville sat back again, crossing his arms like a man declaring victory, and aware that he was only digging himself deeper. "Senator Jasmine," said finally, her voice measured, almost gentle, "do you know what I hear when you laugh like that?" Her tone was calm, but there was something underneath it, a quiet force that made even the cameras seem to lean closer. Tuberville smirked, preparing for another condescending remark, but Jasmine didn't give him the chance. "I hear every veteran who's ever been told their service doesn't count. I hear every woman dismissed as emotional for demanding accountability. I hear every immigrant child mocked for dreaming of a better life. You may think this is a game, but this is people's lives." The words cut through the air like a knife. But Tuberville wasn't about to back down. He chuckled again, this time louder, a laugh meant to fill the silence she had created. "Spare me the lecture," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "This isn't about feelings. This is about facts. Maybe you should focus on doing your homework before you come in here swinging." Gasps rippled through the chamber. The insult was blunt, designed to humiliate, and for a moment, it seemed to hang there like a toxic cloud. Tuberville sat there smugly, as if daring her to take another shot. But Jasmine didn't look rattled. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, her lips curving into the faintest trace of a smile, not amusement, but something sharper. She leaned forward now, mirroring his earlier posture, and the entire energy of the room shifted. It was subtle, but undeniable. Suddenly, Tuberville didn't look quite so comfortable in his chair. "Homework?" she said softly, her words slow and deliberate. "Senator, I've been doing my homework my entire life. While you were blocking promotions for our military heroes, was representing families who sacrificed everything for this country you claim to love." The chamber went still again. Even Tuberville's allies shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine's voice wasn't raised, but it carried a weight that pressed against the room. A warning that this wasn't going to end the way Tuberville thought it would. And yet, she hadn't even started. She had let him throw every insult, every sneer, every dismissive gesture. She had let him believe he was in control, but she wasn't done yet. Jasmine Crockett took a deep breath, her fingers resting lightly on the stack of papers in front of her. She didn't rush. The silence stretched, taut and electric, until even the clicking of pens and the soft whir of cameras seemed deafening. Tuberville leaned back, exuding mock impatience, drumming his fingers as though her pause was proof of weakness. He couldn't see that the pause was the weapon. Jasmine wasn't flustered. She was sharpening the blade. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, calm, and quiet enough that the microphone seemed to strain to capture every syllable. "You talk about homework, Senator?" she began, her gaze fixed squarely on him. "So let's talk about yours." The chamber shifted, the audience straightening in their seats. Tuberville raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. "You've spent months," she continued, her tone slow and deliberate, blocking the promotions of decorated military officers. "Men and women who have sacrificed decades of their lives for this nation because of your personal political crusade. You've jeopardized military readiness, left families in limbo, and weakened the morale of those who serve, all because you wanted attention. And you call that leadership?" Tuberville chuckled softly, a sound that now rang hollow, but Jasmine didn't let it interrupt her rhythm. She reached for a single sheet of paper, holding it carefully, like a relic. "I want to read something to you, Senator," she said. "It's a letter my father wrote from Vietnam in 1970. That got his attention." Smirk faltered just slightly, his arms uncrossing as he shifted in his chair. Jasmine glanced briefly at the cameras, then back at him. "Dear family," she began, her voice carrying the quiet weight of history, "I hope this letter finds you safe. It's been raining for days here, and the mud is ankle-deep. We move through the jungle with our rifles raised, and at night I think of home. I don't know if I'll see Texas again, but I'm proud to be here, proud to serve this country, even if it sometimes doesn't feel like it loves me back." The words seemed to echo off the chamber walls. Even those who'd been scrolling through their phones stopped to listen. Jasmine lowered the paper slowly, her eyes never leaving Tuberville. "My father risked his life for this country, Senator," she said. "He came home to a nation that still questioned his worth as a black man. And now, 50 years later, I sit here and watch you laugh at the sacrifices of men and women like him. People you use for photo ops while you block their promotions, their pay raises, their futures." Tuberville shifted in his seat again, his grin tightening. He reached for his microphone but stopped, realizing he had nothing to say that wouldn't make this worse. "You want to talk about patriotism?" Jasmine continued, her voice rising slightly now, her composure unshaken. "Patriotism isn't laughing in the faces of veterans' children. It's not holding service members hostage to score points on cable news. Patriotism is my father in a jungle he didn't choose to fight in, writing home to a family he didn't know if he'd see again. Patriotism is every single officer whose name you've left in bureaucratic purgatory while you play politics." The tension in the room thickened. Tuberville's jaw tightened. His arms were no longer casually draped, but folded defensively. The cameras zoomed in closer, capturing his every blink. Every twitch. Jasmine flipped through her stack of papers again, pulling out a new document. "Since you like facts, Senator," she said, her voice carrying a razor's edge, "let's look at what your obstruction has done." She began to read off names, each one like a hammer striking an anvil. Generals, colonels, admirals, all stalled in their careers, their lives paused because of one man's ego. "These are real people," she said, "not pawns, not political props. People with families, people who've missed birthdays and anniversaries, who've moved across the world at a moment's notice for this flag you wrap yourself in. And you've disrespected every single one of them." The murmurs in the room grew louder now, reporters furiously typing, colleagues exchanging uneasy glances. Tuberville's confident posture was slipping, his arms folded tighter, his smile vanished completely. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering to a near whisper, forcing the room to lean in with her. "You call yourself a patriot, Senator. But real patriots don't tear down the very institution they claim to defend. Real patriots don't treat our military like leverage. Real patriots understand that service is sacred." She paused, letting the words settle, her eyes locked on him, shifted again, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. Then she delivered the final blow. "So when you laugh at me, you're not just laughing at a congresswoman, you're laughing at my father. At every soldier who came home in a flag-draped coffin. At every immigrant who's worn the uniform in hopes of earning citizenship. Laughing at America itself." Gasps rippled through the chamber. Even those who had been skeptical of her moments before were silent now, stunned by the raw clarity of her words. Tuberville opened his mouth to respond, but closed it just as quickly. There was nothing he could say. Jasmine picked up her father's letter again, holding it for the cameras to see. "This is what sacrifice looks like," she said softly. "It's ink smudged by rain. It's words written by candlelight in a foreign jungle. It's hope carried by men and women who never stopped believing this country could be better. That is patriotism, not sound bites, not smirks. Sacrifice." Silence was deafening. Tuberville's hands fidgeted on the table, his gaze darting toward the reporters scribbling every word. The power dynamic had flipped completely, and everyone in the room felt it. Jasmine leaned back slightly, her composure intact, her voice calm again. "Senator, you've made a mockery of this chamber for too long. But today, you've shown America who you really are." She placed the letter gently back on the stack of papers, her hands folded neatly in front of her. No gloating, no theatrics, just devastating stillness. The cameras panned across the room, capturing colleagues shifting uncomfortably, whispers breaking out, and Tuberville sitting motionless, his smug grin erased. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. She had already won. The entire chamber went silent. Within minutes of Jasmine Crockett's words echoing through the chamber, the moment had already transcended the room where it happened. Clips of her steady voice reading her father's Vietnam letter flooded social media timelines, racking up millions of views before the gavel even struck to adjourn. Hashtag sprang to life. Hashtag letter from Vietnam. Hashtag stand with Jasmine. Hashtag patriotism is sacrifice, trending across Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. The smirk that had once curled across Tommy Tuberville's lips was now frozen in frame after frame, dissected, mocked, and memed into a symbol of arrogance. Millions of viewers cheered her courage. They replayed the clip over and over, mesmerized by the calm precision of her takedown. There was no shouting, no theatrics, no dramatic finger-pointing, just a woman's voice, steady and unflinching, carrying a truth that cut deeper than any insult ever could. "This is Leadership 1." Viral tweet read, accompanied by a side-by-side photo of Jasmine reading the letter and her father in uniform. Another post simply said, "She spoke for all of us." The cable news anchors replayed the exchange on a loop that evening. The moment wasn't framed as another partisan squabble. It was being called a moral reckoning. This wasn't politics, one commentator said solemnly. This was America staring into a mirror and asking who we really are. Networks aired Jasmine's reading of her father's letter in full, pausing after each line to let the weight sink in. On one channel, a military veteran choked up while explaining how deeply her words resonated. She didn't just defend herself. She defended every single one of us who served. Tuberville, meanwhile, found himself at the center of a firestorm. What had been a calculated smirk meant to belittle had backfired spectacularly. His office released a statement calling Jasmine's remarks political theater, but the damage was done. His dismissive laughter was now the subject of editorials, think pieces, and late-night monologues. Even some members of his own party distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with his arrogance. Jasmine, however, didn't gloat. She issued no triumphant press releases, gave no interviews in the immediate aftermath. Restraint only amplified the impact. The video spoke for itself. The public's reaction turned it into something larger than politics. It became a cultural moment. On TikTok, veterans and their families stitched themselves into the viral clip, sharing their own stories of sacrifice. One woman, holding a photo of her late brother in uniform, said softly, "Thank you, Congresswoman, for saying what so many of us feel but can't put into words." On Instagram, artists began sketching portraits of Jasmine reading her father's letter, the image spreading like wildfire as a new symbol of dignity and patriotism. Comment sections overflowed with emotion. Immigrant families shared how her words reminded them of their own struggles and sacrifices to be part of this country. Young activists hailed her composure as a masterclass in moral courage. Even skeptics of political theater admitted this moment felt different, raw, genuine, and impossible to ignore. The ripple effect wasn't confined to social media. The next morning, Newspapers ran headlines like Crockett's.com, Fury Shakes Capitol, and Vietnam Letter becomes symbol of true patriotism. Editorial boards wrote scathing critiques of Tuberville's behavior, with one national paper declaring, "When arrogance met dignity, dignity won." By midday, his smirk was plastered across front pages. Contrasted with Jasmine's resolute expression in classrooms, teachers played the clip to spark discussions about patriotism, service, and respect. In coffee shops, strangers debated what it meant for American politics. And in military households across the country, her father's words became a rallying cry. "It's been raining for days here." It's those words written by a young man in a muddy foxhole half a century earlier, now reverberated through a nation grappling with what service truly means. Meanwhile, Jasmine's phone buzzed nonstop. Messages poured in from colleagues, celebrities, activists, and everyday Americans. Some thanked her for her courage, others for her composure, but most simply wrote, "You spoke for us." Veterans organizations began circulating petitions, calling on Tuberville to lift his blockade of military promotions, citing Jasmine's speech as the final straw. Her quiet moment of truth had ignited a movement, but Jasmine herself remained grounded. She spent that night in her small D.C. apartment, sitting quietly with the original letter in her lap. She thought of her father, of all the sacrifices he had endured, and how his words were now inspiring millions. For her, this wasn't about virality or headlines. It was about honoring him. And every person who had been dismissed, disrespected, or forgotten by those in power. Yet even as praise poured in, the backlash began to brew. Tuberville's loyal supporters doubled down, spinning the narrative as an attack on his values, painting Jasmine as divisive and emotional. Right-wing commentators rushed to reframe the viral moment, accusing her of exploiting her father's service. For political gain, their outrage only added fuel to the fire. It's pushing the clip further into the spotlight by the end of the week. Jasmine wasn't just a congresswoman anymore. She was a symbol. Her calm defiance, her father's letter, and her piercing takedown had transformed a committee hearing into a national moment of reckoning. And while many celebrated her courage, others recognized that this wasn't the end of the story, because for every hashtag and headline, there was something deeper brewing beneath the surface, a shift in public consciousness, a crack in the armor, a political arrogance that had long gone unchallenged. Jasmine had lit a fuse, but no one yet knew how far the flames would spread. The moment had already changed the conversation, but the real impact was still to come in the days that followed. The noise around the viral clip began to settle, but Jasmine's words remained. They echoed far beyond the marble halls of the Capitol, reverberating in living rooms, classrooms, and town halls across America. What started as a heated exchange between two politicians had transformed into something far greater, a moment of collective reflection. People weren't just talking about Tuberville's smirk or Jasmine's calm precision. They were talking about patriotism, dignity, and what it truly means to love a country that doesn't always love you back. For Jasmine, the letter was never meant to be a weapon. It was a reminder. A reminder that freedom is paid for in sleepless nights, scarred bodies, and generations of sacrifice. A reminder that justice isn't an abstract principle debated in polished committee rooms, but something fought for by those willing to endure discomfort, ridicule, and pain. She stood not just as her father's daughter, but as the embodiment of every family who had given a piece of themselves to the idea of America. That's what made the moment resonate so deeply. Jasmine didn't meet arrogance with arrogance. She didn't respond to laughter with rage. She offered something far more powerful. Truth. Truth that cut through partisanship and sound bites. Truth that reminded people of their own roots and struggles. Immigrant families saw themselves in her father's letter. Veterans heard their own memories in every line. And young people saw a leader who refused to be diminished. The power of that truth wasn't in its volume, but in its weight. Had shown the world that real strength doesn't come from belittling others, but from lifting the unseen and unheard. Her quiet composure became a statement of its own, a warning to those who thought cruelty and dismissal were signs of power. It was proof that there is nothing more disarming than dignity, and America responded. Across the country, conversations about military families, veterans, and service surged. For once, social media wasn't just a battlefield of outrage, but a chorus of gratitude. Strangers shared their family letters, photographs, and memories, weaving a tapestry of sacrifice that transcended politics. In a polarized age, Jasmine's calm defiance offered something rare, a unifying story rooted in pain but blooming into pride, even in Washington. Her scandals burned hot and fast before fading into obscurity. This moment lingered. Colleagues from both sides of the aisle approached Jasmine, some with tears in their eyes, admitting they had been moved. Veterans visited her office to thank her for speaking on their behalf. Staffers whispered that they'd never seen Tuberville, so visibly shaken. And for those who had doubted Jasmine's ability to stand her ground, she had not just proven them wrong. She had redefined what standing one's ground looks like. Yet Jasmine never claimed victory. She knew this wasn't about a viral clip or a political win. This was about reclaiming what patriotism meant in a time when it was too often weaponized. She wanted Americans to see that love of country is not loud flag-waving or smug dismissal of dissent. It's sacrifice. It's resilience. It's choosing to show up for democracy, even when democracy doesn't show up for you. She carried her father's letter everywhere now, folded carefully in her bag, not as a prop but as a reminder. When people asked her why she read it aloud, her answer was simple: because truth deserves a voice, even when laughter tries to drown it out. And that was why the moment lived on, not just in headlines, but in hearts. Because Jasmine's words weren't hers alone. They belonged to every family who had sent a loved one into battle, every immigrant who had taken their first steps on American soil, every person who had been mocked or dismissed yet refused to back down. She had taken an insult meant to belittle and turned it into a mirror, forcing a nation to see itself. It wasn't just a debate anymore. It was a reminder that dignity is louder than arrogance, that service is stronger than mockery, and that courage often speaks in a whisper. And that night, America saw the power of truth.